Hey everybody, let's pick up with chapter 2. This is slide 42 in this lecture series. And we were talking all about ecosystems and how different organisms interact with non-living things in their area. So animals and plants, the water, soil, nutrients, all of these things are interacting all of the time. And so what kind of chemicals and the physical aspects of different environments really that impacts what kind of species can live there, or even if they even can live there. And so the example we've been discussing a little bit in this chapter is about the Chesapeake Bay estuary. And that term estuary might be a new term for you. So the estuary is this kind of interface area between the fresh water, the land, and the ocean. And so estuaries have very high productivity because they are receiving a lot of nutrients from the fresh water and the land, as well as continuously getting things from the ocean too. So these areas throughout the world, there are many estuaries, are considered to be very productive ecosystems. And the organisms that live there are really affected then by the sediment, the nutrients, and all these other things that are coming in. And it can be that those systems can be overwhelmed, as in the case of what happened in the Chesapeake Bay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different kind of processes here, including photosynthesis and respiration and decomposition that all these organisms are experiencing. And if we look at the energy flows that go in between these areas, we have the sun is ultimately the energy source for all life on this planet. All living things ultimately get their energy from the sun. In the case of this slide, we have the grass, the producers. This is a terrestrial example there on the left. And so we have these plants. Any plant is considered to be a producer. We have an insect that would be something eating the grasses. Then rodents eat the insects, and then hawks eat the rodents. And so these, as we go up through, this is a basic form of a food cycle, a food web. As you can see, the red arrows are showing where the energy is going. So in a lot of different places here, heat is escaping. That's what all the orange or the red arrows represent, is heat escaping from all of these different organisms back into the atmosphere. The green arrows show the chemical energy, the food that these organisms are getting from each other when they eat them. Eventually things do die and do decompose, and now we have something called detritus. That's a new word for a lot of people. Detritus is non-living organic matter. These are things that used to be alive. It could be twigs or leaves, things like that. Those are often consumed by things called detritivores and decomposers. The soil bacteria or bacteria are often decomposers. Earthworms are a good example of a detritivores. And if we look, again, we see that heat is being released through the system. The detritivores and the decomposers, that the energy is being transferred back and forth between them. So this is a good example of how the sun's energy basically flows through the different ecosystems, including the animals and the plants on the planet. The energy is transformed from the solar light energy to chemical energy, the energy that's inside of the bonds of all of the food that we eat. That's chemical energy. If we look at the other figure here, this is showing you that matter is recycled within the ecosystems. And at various times, there could be water released, there could be waste products released, and again, there could be heat that is released. So if you just take a second and kind of step back and look at all of these arrows, you can see that all of these different levels of the food web are actually all connected, right? And they're all interacting with each other. But again, the sun is the kickstarter for all of the nutrient flows through all of these food webs. So I mentioned to you such a thing as primary production. And this is the conversion of solar energy to chemical energy. It happens by autotrophs using photosynthesis. Again, if you remember what autotrophs are, those are plants, those are cyanobacteria that can do this. Algae is an autotroph. They are considered to be, quote, self-feeders, and they are able to collect and convert that solar energy. Any of the total amount of the energy that's produced by these organisms, that's called the gross primary production. And most of that energy that they're making here is actually going to be used for themselves. They're going to use it within their own metabolism. There's such a thing as the net primary production, NPP. It usually isn't spelled out. Usually the initials are just used. So the net primary production is all the energy that remains after respiration. Typically, this will at least equal the gross primary production minus those cellular respirations. So organisms have to be able to maintain their own body, and so that's the cellular respiration that's going on. But there is oftentimes, especially in very productive ecosystems, where the ecosystem is healthy and the organisms are thriving. And again, we're talking about plants here. Lots of times there is extra production, and that's used then to generate leaves and stems and roots, flowers and fruits. And that is really what's available then for all of the heterotrophs. So all of the organisms that feed on other things, this is what is available to them to be able to eat. And so if there was an area that had very low primary productivity, very few plants growing very well, then you would expect to not find very many animals there. So however much NPP is in an area, that tells you something about the kind of plants that you would find there. It tells you something about how many animals you would find there. If there's very little NPP, then there's not going to be a very extensive food web, because animals all depend on these plants. However much NPP is there, that's all they have. And so if we go and we look at some of these different areas, this graph talks about terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. So the terrestrial systems are here in green and the aquatic systems are in blue. The net primary productivity is always displayed as grams per meter squared per year. For those of you who are used to the metric system, a gram weighs about as much as an American dime. So if you've ever held a dime in your hand, that's equal to about a gram. So there are some areas where the bars are larger that have very high net primary productivity. There are plants there that are able to grow very quickly. They are really great at converting the solar energy into biomass, and so there's lots of food available, and so there's a lot more extensive animals in those areas. So if we look, the highest terrestrial ecosystem is the tropical rainforest, which probably isn't a surprise to most of you. Next are algal beds and reefs. And these are considered to be the best places for aquatic productivity. On the other end of this graph, the areas that have the least productivity would be the desert and semi-desert shrub areas, and then the open ocean. And a lot of people are surprised when they see that the open ocean has such low productivity. So I'm going to wait for a minute and let you guys think about why is it that the open ocean does have such low productivity. And remember, when we're equating productivity, that we're thinking about plant growth. So if you have decided that there probably are not very many plants growing in the open ocean. You were correct. Typically, the open ocean is so deep that there can't be any plants that are rooted in that area. And so oftentimes the only plant life are, phytoplankton and very small things. And so the open ocean is considered to be very unproductive. So all of these different areas you can find, and we're going to discuss some of these different ecosystems in a future chapter. But I think about, we're in Ohio. Ohio is a temperate deciduous forest, which is here in the center. So we have moderate productivity, and that's why we do have as many animals that share the ecosystem with us. That's why plants and agriculture do so well here in Ohio. Because we have the plants are able to grow in our ecosystem pretty well, and they're pretty quick about doing that. So throughout this book, you're going to hear at different stage about ecological modeling, and we've talked in the previous chapter about exactly what the scientific method is all about. And that's really, ecological modelers are looking at relationships between all of the variables that are in nature. And then they try to develop models to explain those relationships and then make predictions. So generally this involves, someone collecting environmental data. That environmental data is then pooled with lots of other environmental data. And people have ideas about, oh, well, I propose, for instance, that if we limit how much nitrogen is going into Chesapeake Bay, that we would be able to increase oyster productivity and increase water quality. And so then they would basically run computer simulations or models to sort of see if their hypothesis is correct. And constantly data is being gathered, new data, new technologies coming online all the time, and that model's continuously being refined. So, this is just one way of trying to explain all of the variables that you could have in an ecosystem. And so computer modeling, most models tend to be pretty inaccurate, although with more and more information, the models get better and better. So I don't know where you live, but if you think about your weather forecast, that's all computer modeling. And so if we want to look at what the weather might be like next week, lots of times those models are inaccurate, right? It might say that it's going to rain 4 days next week, and then it doesn't rain any. But if we really want to know what the weather is going to be like, we'll probably wait till the day before or the hour before. And over time, those models get better and better. The closer to the event, the less variables there are. And so I think looking at weather forecasting is a good example of modeling. And so it does change quite a bit. If we look at basically the ecosystem services that all of these different systems provide to us, these are the things that we have to have in order to be able to live a healthy life. And so having these ecosystem services, any of these ecosystems, once they become damaged, then we have to put a lot of energy and resources back into sort of fixing those things and supplying those services to ourselves. So an example of that would be, let's say that we kill off all the insect predators that there are. We use a really, 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 really strong pesticide that kills off all the predators. Well, then now farmers have to use synthetic pesticides to try to kill off the pests that are harming their crops. So by killing the predators that would have normally eaten those pests, Now the farmers have to defend the crops themselves. A lot of those pesticides can actually harm people and water and wildlife as well. So it would have been better had we not killed those insect predators in the beginning. Nutrient cycling is one of the most important ecosystem services. And we are going to spend the rest of this chapter really discussing nutrients and nutrient systems. If we go to the next slide, and I guess I would like you to, if you have the ebook, then I'd like you to make note of the page number that this table is on. If not, maybe just even, and I hate having things printed out because I don't like wasting paper, but this table is very important. In every exam we're going to have, I'm going to be asking you about ecosystem services. And these are all the different processes that benefit us in various ways. And, when we're going to be talking about water, then there are some ecosystem services here that are related to water. If we're talking about food, there are some that are other, for that. So I'd like you to actually look, and I don't want you to sit and try to memorize all these, but I would like you to look down through the list and just understand them. So what does the ecosystem actually give to us? And try to make sure that you understand these. If we look at these nutrient cycles that I mentioned to you, nutrients are constantly moving through the environment, and lots of times it's in a pretty complex way. Matter is also continuously being circulated in the environment. So the nutrients that we're going to discuss, these are actually called the biogeochemical cycle. And if we break that big word down, bio, right, means life, and then geo is land or rocks, and then chemistry, chemicals. And so these are nutrients that move through the ecosystems, through living things, and then into the other part of the ecosystem as well. It really involves two main kind of pools or reservoirs where those nutrients reside. There's a source pool, and then there is a sink. So if we kind of look at that a little bit closer, we'll see that a source is a place that releases more materials than it accepts. A sink is a reservoir that accepts more than it releases. And how fast the materials move back and forth in between each other, that's called the flux. And so some of these compounds move at incredibly fast rates in large quantities, and that would be considered to be a large flux. And then they might be in that sink for a very long residence time. Other times they're only in that organism or in that sink for a short time, and then they're released back again to wherever their source was, and that would be considered to be a small flux. So let's do the water cycle first. A lot of you, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide. Here we go. The water cycle is, one that a lot of people have, that you already know a lot about the water cycle. And so the water cycle is also referred to as the hydrologic cycle. And the water cycle really affects all the other cycles. That's why we're going to talk about the water cycle first. And so water is really essential for biochemical reactions. It's involved in almost every environmental system and cycle. And so we're really looking at here the flow of water, and it can be liquid, gas, or solid water through the environment. Most of the water on this planet is salt water, seawater. It's in the oceans. Less than 1% of our water is readily available as fresh water. And try to remember that number, because that's not very much fresh water that we actually have on this planet. Most of it is in the form of salt water. We'll talk more about water later in the semester. So if we look at the different phases of water, because again, I mentioned to you that water can change, whether it's a solid, liquid, or gas. Evaporation is when liquid water is converted to gaseous water. If anybody here has ever boiled water and made tea, or you boiled water and you've seen the steam coming off, that's a good example of evaporation, right? You had liquid water and you've turned it into water vapor. Transpiration is one of the parts of this cycle that people often forget. So put a big star next to the word transpiration, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. That's the release of water vapor by plants. A lot of people haven't studied botany or plants, and they don't really realize how much water vapor plants are releasing, but it's a tremendous amount. Precipitation is when the water then returns back to the Earth's surfaces. Sometimes it can be in the form of rain or snow or ice. It doesn't always have to be liquid, and that's called precipitation. So on this mirror or window that you see here, you can see that the water vapor has actually condensed into liquid water. So once, there was a lot of water vapor in the air, it hit a colder surface, the water vapor became liquid, and somebody wrote the letter C. Since my name is Carolyn, I think that's for me. And so that's condensation, is really gaseous water becoming liquid water. If we look at the water that's stored underground, there's such a thing called infiltration. And this is where water soaks down through the rocks and the soils to recharge aquifers. And you might have heard of aquifers, right? There's a famous bottled water called Aquafina. But aquifers are these underground reservoirs of regions of rock that are very spongy. And these areas actually hold groundwater. And so groundwater is the water that is found underneath, between the layers of soil. The water table is the uppermost level of groundwater held in the aquifer. And some places in the world, the water table is very, very shallow. Some places it's really, really deep. A lot of the water in aquifers in the desert Southwest are considered to be very, very ancient. Some of that water that's there can be thousands of years old. Oftentimes it's called fossil water. These older aquifers like that tend to be very, very deep. Some of them are hundreds or even 1,000 feet deep in the ground. And so those are very deep aquifers. The water table where you live, that affects everything from the kind of construction you can have, whether you have a basement in your house. It impacts what kind of roads and bridges and things can be built. So places that have very shallow water tables, like for example in the United States, Florida, most of all of the homes in Florida don't have a basement. If they were to try to dig a basement for storage or something underneath their property, it would just fill up with water. Likewise, places in like Louisiana, near New Orleans, their water table is so shallow that they can't even bury anything there. If they were to go and make a grave and bury somebody, the water table would be right there, and the body would just pop back up. So the water table really influences a lot of things, including the cost of acquiring fresh water. So if you have a really shallow water table, then lots of times local people will have their own well in their home or in their farm, and that's the water that they use, and it's free and it's right there. That's very different than some places where you have to bring in massive drilling equipment, and you might have to drill an aquifer down hundreds of feet deep. That would cost a lot of money to be able to do that. And so the water table is an interesting feature of the water system. If we look at a graph that represents the water cycle, maybe this is easier for you to understand than just looking at text. And so we show here where the ice caps and the glaciers and the snowfields are. We show that there's a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. When there's precipitation, then the water comes down. Everything below ground is about these aquifers that we just mentioned. And again, people do extract the groundwater. That's where most of our drinking water comes from. If we look at that farm for human use, right, we're using it, we're maybe irrigating our fields with it. Lots of times, if it rains a lot and there's flooding, there can be runoff, and then that runoff can go to the local lakes and creeks and rivers and eventually flow back out into the ocean as well. The one part of this I want you to pay attention to, because I think most people understand the rest of it, is that transpiration cycle. And those land plants can transpire hundreds of gallons of water a day. So they can take the water from the soil and then put it back into the atmosphere. And that's part of the water cycle that people forget. When we don't have those plants doing that, then those areas tend to be a lot drier. Lots of times there's not as much precipitation because it just doesn't rain. And so the water cycle is, again, one of the easier ones to sort of understand. So let's look at what people have done with the water cycle. We are going to talk a little bit more another time about dams, but when people install a dam on a river, that slows down water movement and it increases the evaporation a lot. If you remove all the vegetation, that causes runoff and soil erosion, and now we don't have as much infiltration and transpiration going on. So the water literally runs off the land and it's lost. So keeping vegetation there is important. If we drill and overdraw so much of the surface and groundwater for agriculture, sometimes that then can actually lower the water table. And so overdrawing is the same thing as pumping and using wells to get access to that water. If we lower the water table, then it's possible that we could actually run out of usable fresh water. It's also possible that then people have to go back in and drill another well and make it deeper and deeper and use more expensive pumping equipment to be able to get access to that water. Lastly, emitting air pollution, pollutants that are water soluble, that can actually change the nature of precipitation. So you might have heard about acid rain. It's possible that if we have a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere, that can then rain as nitric acid, or sulfur can rain as sulfuric acid. And so any of these air pollutants that have the potential to dissolve in water, that can change the chemistry of the water when it does rain. So the next cycle we'd like to look at is the carbon cycle. And again, the carbon cycle is one of those cycles that you do know a lot about. The carbon is really describes the carbon route in the environment. The carbon forms very essential biological molecules. Everything that's alive on the planet, including yourself, is carbon based. So carbon is used in all living organisms here, including plants and people and animals. Carbon moves into living things through photosynthesis. The carbon dioxide that's in the air and in the water, that's really not used and available to organisms directly, except for plants. And so it's the photosynthesis process that makes that carbon available to living things. Respiration, when you exhale, you're giving off CO2. When your cells are doing cellular respiration, CO2 is produced. And then decomposition, when eventually things die and decompose, that returns carbon to the air and to the water as well. So eventually everything is going to be decomposed and returns, cycles the carbon back into the air as well. So the carbon cycle is is again something that everybody knows about a little bit. The oceans are the second largest reservoir of carbon. They absorb carbon from the air and from the land and from the organisms. The atmosphere is the largest reservoir of carbon. When things decompose, I did mention to you that the carbon then is returned to sediments, and this is where most of the carbon that is fixed is in sediments. It's possible that that carbon can be converted into fossil fuels, and this is showing you some coal here that is considered to be, fossilized carbon. And but the problem is with fossil fuels is it has to be the right conditions, and sometimes it does take a long time for that carbon that's in the sediments to be captured and converted back into fossil fuels. We don't think that the current environment is really conducive to making more fossil fuels. That's why they're considered to be non-renewable, just because it takes so long to make them. So let's look at a figure of the carbon cycle, a diagram, and kind of follow it through. So again, we have a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. Follow all the arrows, and all the gray arrows are pretty much showing you where the carbon's going. Most of them are going up. So anytime that any fossil fuels are combusted, and combusted just means burned. So it could be in a factory, it could be at a power plant, it could be from a car, it could be from your houses, the heating, when you burn things, usually fossil fuels to make heat for your homes, CO2 is being released. Plants and organisms like us do respire, and so you see respiration arrows going up. You do see one arrow going down, and that's photosynthesis. So that is how CO2 is fixed, meaning that CO2 becomes something solid and not a gas anymore, and that's through the process of photosynthesis. When people, animals, plants die and decompose, CO2 is being released at that point as well. Again, there's a possibility of these things becoming fossil fuels, but that's not likely currently. And so we are extracting lots of fossil fuels, right? Oil, natural gas, coal, and then when we burn those, we give off a lot of CO2. Over on the left-hand side, you see a volcano. When volcanoes erupt or we have some thermal emissions, a lot of CO2 is given off during that process. That's one of the big unknowns with the carbon cycle. It's really hard to figure out. Some of the modeling about climate change, it's very hard to account for volcanic eruptions, because we just don't know how many there are going to be each year and how much carbon is going to be released. So that's one of the big unknowns with trying to do climate change modeling of the volcanoes. There is an aquatic part of the carbon cycle as well. Oceans absorb a tremendous amount of CO2, and they have absorbed a tremendous amount of CO2. A lot of that is now, that carbon is in sedimentary rocks. If we look at the little circle picture at the top of this diagram here, we see that there are organisms here in the water, right? Fish that are respiring. There are plants that are the producers, algae and other aquatic plants, and they're pulling CO2 out of the air as well. So that's the carbon cycle. I really like you to focus a lot on the carbon cycle, because we are going to be discussing the carbon cycle throughout the semester, especially when we talk about climate change. So how have humans actually impacted the carbon cycle? Well, anytime we burn these fossil fuels, we're removing carbon from the ground up into the air. And since the mid 1700s, we've added, and don't worry about that number, but we've added billions of tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. When we cut down forests and we burn fields, or there are wildfires like there were in Australia and California, that releases a tremendous amount of carbon from those organisms back into the air. Remember again, anything that's alive or used to be alive is all carbon based. So when those things are burned or combusted, that is releasing carbon back to the atmosphere. There's a lot less carbon that's removed by photosynthesis, really because there's a lot less plants, right? We used to have millions and millions of acres of forests, and a lot of those forests have been cleared and cut down. Right now, today's atmospheric carbon dioxide reservoir is the largest in the last 800,000 years. And I'll tell you towards the end of this class, the end of the semester, how we know that that's true. There's a lot of data gathering, including looking at ice cores, so we know how much CO2 used to be in the air versus now. So the change in the carbon cycle is really the driving force between human-caused global climate change. So anthropogenic means, anthro means man, but we're going to say humans. This is what is causing global climate change now, is the way that we have impacted the carbon cycle. So I think this is a good place to stop now, and we'll finish up the rest of this chapter with our next lecture, and we'll talk about a couple of more cycles and why they're important to you. So please email me, contact me if you have any questions at all. I wish we were all together so you could just ask me a question right now, but I'm always available. So please email me or call me if you have any questions. All right, everybody, I'll finish this up next time. We only have a few slides left. All right, talk to you later.